Everyone expected it to be the happiest day of her life, a dreamy wedding with all eyes on the glowing bride. But what started with flowers and vows quickly turned into a humiliating nightmare. In front of hundreds, she was shamed, mocked, and left speechless, by none other than the groom himself. Guests gasped, cameras froze, and whispers turned to chaos. Just when it seemed the night couldn't get worse, she did the unthinkable. With a fierce look and tear-streaked eyes, she got into a Rolls Royce, not with the groom, but with his father. What really happened?
Chapter 1. The Perfect Beginning.
She was the kind of woman who turned heads without trying, poised, elegant, and effortlessly graceful, the kind of bride people expected to be in magazines, not walking through a village gate in a handcrafted lehenga. Her name was Ariba. From a middle-class background but raised with dignity and strength, she carried herself like royalty. Her wedding wasn't meant to be extravagant by billionaire standards, but for her family, it was everything. Years of savings, months of planning, and endless dreams were poured into a single day. The venue was a beautiful farmhouse on the edge of the city, decorated with jasmine garlands, fairy lights, and golden drapes. It was exactly how she had envisioned it. From childhood diaries to late-night Pinterest boards, Ariba had always dreamed of this kind of wedding. Not flashy, but elegant. Not loud, but deeply meaningful. The kind of event where love was the centerpiece, not the decor. Her mother had spent weeks obsessing over details. The perfect shade of maroon for her dress, the exact fragrance of the fresh flowers, the soft music playing in the background. Her father, a quiet man, had said little, but his eyes carried a permanent glimmer of pride and love that day. For them, this wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a symbol of hope, effort, and everything they had worked for. The groom, Fahad, came from a more affluent background. Son of a powerful businessman, he had met Ariba 2 years ago at a mutual friend's event. Despite the differences in class and lifestyle, their chemistry had been undeniable, or so she thought. He was charming, well-dressed, and articulate, everything her parents wanted for her. More importantly, he had convinced her that love could exist between two very different worlds. He had promised to protect her, respect her, and always stand beside her, even if the world didn't. Guests started pouring in early. Relatives flew in from different cities, neighbors dressed in their finest, and social media influencers hired by the groom's side began capturing every moment like it was a fashion show. There were hashtags trending, drone cameras flying, and choreographed entries being rehearsed till the last second. Yet amidst the chaos, Ariba sat quietly in her room, her heart steady, her eyes filled with hope. She wasn't nervous. She was ready. She had given her all to this relationship, and she was entering this marriage with complete faith. The makeup artist whispered, "You look like a queen," and she smiled humbly. Her closest friends adjusted her dupatta and gave her pep talks, but she barely heard them. Her mind was fixed on the life ahead, the future she was stepping into. She thought about the little apartment they would move into, the coffee they'd share in the mornings, the trips they had planned, the children they had already jokingly named. Everything felt perfect. The timing, the setting, the families, the air. Even the sun seemed to shine a little softer that day. People looked at her and said she was glowing, that she was lucky, that Fahad was lucky to have her. No one could have guessed what the day had in store. No one. Not even Ariba. Chapter 2. Signs of Trouble. From the outside, everything appeared seamless, a picture-perfect wedding unfolding with poise and glamour. But beneath the surface, subtle cracks had begun to show. They weren't loud, dramatic signals, rather soft disturbances that only the observant could catch. The first whisper of unease came days before the wedding. Fahad had grown distant. His replies became shorter, his tone colder. Ariba had chalked it up to pre-wedding stress. "He's overwhelmed," she told herself. "It's normal for grooms to get nervous." But the pattern persisted. He stopped answering her calls promptly. Texts were often left unread. The late-night conversations that once flowed so naturally became awkward, filled with long silences and half-hearted chuckles. When she asked if everything was okay, he brushed it off with a tired, "Just work pressure." The words sounded believable, but the energy behind them didn't. Something in his voice had shifted. The warmth was missing. His visits to her house became less frequent. When he did show up, he often came late and left early. Her mother noticed it too, but chose to remain silent. Ariba's friends, however, exchanged concerned glances. They sensed the change, but no one wanted to be the bearer of doubt. After all, the wedding was just days away, and no one wanted to plant suspicion in a bride's heart. Then came the sudden involvement of the groom's mother in every little decision, from the food menu to the color of the bridesmaids' dresses. Her tone wasn't collaborative. It was controlling. She started demanding changes that went against months of planning. When Ariba's family tried to reason with her, she played the victim. "We just want what's best for our son," she would say, making the simplest discussions feel like battles. The most unsettling moment happened during the Mendi function. While everyone else danced and celebrated, Fahad remained at a distance, glued to his phone. He barely made eye contact with Ariba. When he finally joined her for photos, his smile seemed forced. One of the photographers even commented jokingly, "Sir, thoda pyar se dekhiye to lagayega dulha hai." Fahad responded with a stiff laugh and quickly walked away. Ariba tried to stay calm, but her instincts were starting to speak louder. She started noticing the way Fahad avoided her gaze. His compliments disappeared. There was a coldness in his presence, not hostility, but disinterest. During the final wedding rehearsal, he forgot important cues they had practiced together. When she reminded him, he snapped. "It's not a performance, Ariba. Stop being so dramatic." That sentence cut deeper than she expected. Not just the words, but the way he said her name, like it was a burden. On the day of the wedding, the tension only escalated. He arrived late and alone. His father was seen pacing on the phone, while his mother barked orders at the decorators. There was confusion around seating arrangements and arguments between the two families over trivial details. Every time someone asked where Fahad was, the answer came with a shrug. No one seemed to know or care enough to find out. The energy had shifted. Smiles turned thinner. Conversations grew shorter. People noticed but didn't speak. Ariba, still in her bridal room, remained unaware of the brewing storm. Her heart still beat with hope, but the signs were already there, loud enough for those willing to hear them. And yet, the ceremony was still to begin. Chapter 3. The Public Humiliation. The atmosphere was tense, yet no one expected what was about to unfold. The rituals were underway, cameras were rolling, and guests were fully immersed in the grandeur of the event. But as the spotlight turned toward the couple during the post-ceremony speech, a casual moment where the bride and groom usually exchanged light-hearted gratitude or stories, something unprecedented happened. Fahad, instead of offering the usual affectionate words, began his speech with sarcasm. What should have been an emotional acknowledgement turned into a passive-aggressive monologue. He made a series of snide remarks about how weddings were overrated, how everything was done for the gram, and how people pretend to be in love when they barely know each other. Laughter was forced, and glances were exchanged across the audience. Some thought he was joking, others weren't so sure. He went further. He joked about how hard it had been to deal with Ariba's over-planning and melodrama. He claimed she was obsessed with perfection and made everything about herself. From the lehenga to the lighting, every inch of this wedding had to be exactly how she wanted, he said, half smirking, even if no one else could breathe. Ariba's friends looked stunned. Her family froze. The groom's words had shifted from playful to personal and cruel. Then came the real blow. Fahad hinted in front of everyone that he had been pressured into the marriage, that he didn't have the courage to say no when things moved too fast. He even casually mentioned that his parents had made the final decision. "But hey," he said, raising his glass, "sometimes life gives you what you need, not what you want." The crowd fell into an uneasy silence. It was no longer entertainment. It was humiliation. The expression on Ariba's face changed. While she maintained composure, the pain was evident. Guests who moments earlier were live streaming the event slowly put their phones down. Relatives whispered. A few tried to distract themselves with food or conversation, but the damage had already been done. The dignity of the bride, the one person the day was meant to celebrate, had been trampled under the guise of honesty and cheap laughs. To make things worse, some members of Fahad's family chuckled along, treating his words like a roast. His mother looked amused, almost proud. His father, however, looked away, uncomfortable, possibly even ashamed. Ariba's parents were speechless. Her mother was on the verge of tears, while her father stared at the stage, struggling to process what had just happened. No apology followed, no clarification. Fahad ended his remarks casually and returned to his seat, sipping from his drink like nothing had happened. For a brief moment, everything paused, music, chatter, clapping, as people waited to see how Ariba would respond. But she said nothing. She sat still, holding back emotion, surrounded by dozens of flashing cameras and hundreds of confused faces. Her closest friends rushed to her side, offering support in whispers and glances. The event continued, but the mood had changed entirely. Guests began leaving earlier than expected. The celebratory spark was gone, replaced by discomfort, pity, and confusion. A wedding that was meant to be remembered for its beauty had become unforgettable for a completely different reason. People would go home that night and replay Fahad's words. Some would defend him, others would condemn him. But no one would forget how a bride was belittled at her own wedding, not in private, but in full view of the world she trusted. Chapter 4. Silence and Shock. The moment Fahad ended his speech, the entire atmosphere turned fragile. What had once been filled with joy and noise was now wrapped in a heavy silence, not the kind that follows awe, but the kind that follows damage. Guests sat stiff, unsure of how to react. Some exchanged nervous glances, others stared blankly at the stage, hoping someone else would break the tension first. No one expected what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just a poor joke or a bad moment, it was a complete emotional betrayal. Among the guests, whispers slowly began circulating. Some leaned over to ask if there had been a fight earlier. Others speculated that the couple had never truly been on the same page. Several elders shook their heads in disapproval, whispering things like, "Ye sab cameras ke liye karte hain," or "Sharafat khatam ho gayi hai." The younger crowd looked more stunned than anything else. They scrolled back through their phones, reviewing the clip in disbelief. Some had even captured Fayad's words live. The bride's humiliation had already begun spreading. Ariba's close friends were the first to emotionally respond. Two of them walked off stage briefly, visibly upset. Another stood near her, eyes red, whispering words of comfort. None of them had ever seen her this way. Silent, frozen, yet clearly broken. She had always been strong, always composed. But in that moment, she looked like someone who had been publicly betrayed by the one person she trusted the most. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was personal devastation. Her family remained in shock. Her mother was visibly shaken, trembling, eyes full of pain, struggling to maintain grace. She had waited years to see her daughter as a bride, and now that memory was stained. Her father's expression was harder to read. He sat motionless, his hands clenched together. Those who knew him well said they had never seen such restrained anger in his eyes. He didn't speak, but everything about his posture spoke volumes. Confusion, hurt, helplessness. Some guests tried to normalize the situation with forced laughter and superficial distractions. "Maybe he was nervous," someone offered. "Maybe it's just his sense of humor," another said, clearly uncomfortable. But even they knew these excuses were paper-thin. No one could justify what had been said, especially not at such a sacred, once-in-a-lifetime moment. The rest of the ceremony continued in fragments. The energy was broken, the music lost its meaning, and even the most beautiful decorations felt meaningless under the weight of what had happened. Guests began leaving earlier than expected, citing excuses: traffic, kids, work in the morning. But everyone knew the real reason. No one wanted to be part of a celebration that had turned into a spectacle of cruelty. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of shock, grief, and questions no one had answers to. Chapter 5. The Bold Exit. After the shock had settled into a numbing silence, all eyes quietly shifted toward Ariba. Her stillness had lasted longer than anyone expected, but what came next was something no one could have predicted. She didn't break down. She didn't lash out. Instead, she chose something far more powerful: dignity. Without saying a word, she stood up in the middle of the crumbling celebration and made a decision that would change the entire course of that day. There was no dramatic announcement, no emotional plea, no confrontation, just calm, controlled resolve. Her family initially tried to persuade her to stay seated, thinking it was a temporary reaction, but one look at her face, and they knew. She had made up her mind. The woman who had arrived at the venue with hope in her heart was no longer willing to let that hope be crushed by anyone, especially not the man who was supposed to protect it. The murmurs began again, this time more intense. Guests stood confused as she walked past rows of tables and flower arrangements, her dupatta trailing behind her like a closing curtain on a scene that was never meant to play out this way. People watched in disbelief as the bride chose to walk away from her own wedding, not because of a scandal, but because of her self-respect. It was bold, shocking, and deeply admirable. Outside, the groom's father had been standing by his car, engaged in tense phone calls, clearly displeased with how things had unfolded. From the very beginning, he had appeared different from the rest of his family. He had been courteous, respectful, and noticeably distant from the drama. He had watched his son's behavior in silence, but with a frown that said more than words ever could. When he saw Ariba approaching, something shifted. In a moment that would later become the most talked-about part of the evening, he walked toward her. No questions, no judgment. He simply nodded in quiet understanding. It was as though he had seen enough to realize the kind of woman his son had just publicly dishonored, and the kind of daughter-in-law his family had just lost. The guests, who had been frozen in awkward silence, now erupted in a new wave of whispers. Phones captured photos, videos, headlines in the making. People would talk for days about how the bride left her own wedding with the groom's father. Speculations, interpretations, and even criticisms would follow. But Ariba didn't stop to explain herself. She owed no one an answer. And with that bold exit, the narrative of the night shifted entirely. It was no longer about a ruined wedding. It became the story of a woman who refused to let her worth be measured by someone else's immaturity. Chapter 6. The Truth Revealed. In the days that followed, the story of Ariba's wedding spread like wildfire. Social media was flooded with clips, hashtags, opinions, and speculation. Some admired her courage. Others were desperate to know the full story. What began as a public humiliation had now turned into a mystery everyone wanted to solve. Why had the groom behaved the way he did? Why had the groom's father taken such a bold stance in her favor? And what really happened behind the scenes? It didn't take long before whispers turned into confirmations. The first truth to emerge came from within Fahad's own circle. A close friend anonymously revealed that Fahad had been having doubts about the marriage for months, but instead of confronting the issue maturely, he had kept up appearances to avoid conflict with his family. His father had insisted on honoring the engagement, partly because of the family's public image and partly because he genuinely believed Ariba was a good match. But Fahad, immature and ego-driven, felt cornered and chose to express his frustration not in private, but by humiliating Ariba in front of everyone. More disturbing details came out soon after. It was discovered that Fahad had been in an on-and-off relationship with another woman, someone his parents strongly disapproved of. While the relationship had supposedly ended, it had continued quietly behind closed doors. Fahad's public behavior was less about nerves and more about rebellion, a way to sabotage a marriage he didn't have the courage to call off himself. Instead of being honest, he turned his own cowardice into cruelty. But the most unexpected truth was the role of his father. The man who stood by Ariba at the wedding had not done so out of impulse. He had been aware of his son's behavior for weeks. In private conversations, he had warned Fahad multiple times about his irresponsibility and arrogance. He had even attempted to delay the wedding, but pressure from extended family and social expectations kept the event moving forward. On the day of the wedding, after witnessing the humiliation firsthand, the father had reached a breaking point. He had spent years building a reputation based on integrity, and watching his own son destroy a woman's dignity in front of hundreds was not something he could silently accept. His support for Ariba wasn't just out of pity, it was a statement that values, character, and humanity mattered more than blood ties. Following the incident, Fahad faced backlash from both family and the public. His relationship with his father deteriorated rapidly. Business allies distanced themselves quietly. The family's social circle changed overnight. Meanwhile, Ariba chose not to engage in media interviews or emotional tell-alls. She resumed her life privately, focusing on healing, reclaiming her self-worth, and moving forward with quiet resilience. In the end, the truth that emerged was not just about a broken wedding. It was about the cost of silence, the power of self-respect, and the rare strength it takes to walk away with grace. Ariba's story didn't end with betrayal. It began with it. And from that beginning rose a new chapter, where her voice was not defined by victimhood, but by choice. Thanks for watching.